The Hiperfire PDI, let's talk about it. So I was really trying to figure out how I was going to approach this review, as the Hiperfire PDI for the AR-15 is one of the most unique triggers that I've used. And another thing I wanted to do was really give this enough range time to give an honest review of how the performance was, the trigger break, the reliability of a trigger, because those are all really important aspects of a trigger. I bought my first Hyperfire PDI over a year ago, and I've been using it ever since. And I've put over 2,000 rounds downrange with various types of ammunition from 7.62 by 39 to 300 blackout to 5.56 and 223 Remington, and the Hyperfire PDI has performed flawlessly. I've also put this in a PCC, and actually I bought this trigger to put in my PCC, as this is direct blowback rated, and some drop-in cassette triggers aren't really designed for that direct blowback out of a PCC. I also wanted to test out some other top-tier triggers and mid-tier triggers just to make sure that the Hyperfire PDI was as good as I thought it was. In fact, it was so good that I decided to purchase 3, and that's saying a lot. I really don't purchase multiples of the same item unless I really like them. And obviously, I really like the Hyperfire PDI. So let's get right into this review. The Hyperfire PDI comes in 3 different colors. It comes in black, gold, rose gold, and a black for the Sig Sauer MCX Rattler. The black PDIs are curved triggers, and the gold and rose gold PDIs are actually straight triggers. All of them come with something called a hyper shoe, which allows your finger to get consistent finger placement on the trigger, and it is adjustable. It seems kind of gimmicky, but it actually works, and I've grown pretty fond of it. And the only other trigger that I can think of with another feature like it is the Timney Calvin Elite. Some other features of note are that it is a drop-in trigger system. It has a 2-pound trigger pull or a claimed 2-pound trigger pull. I actually get lighter than 2 pounds. It's got a mill-grade hammer strike, so no light primer strikes ever, it claims. And I can actually attest to that. It's got a titanium nitride or H&M black nitride finish. It is pretty smooth, and it's got a polished look. It is PCC blowback rated, as I mentioned before. And it has some other jargon that I'm not exactly sure what it does. So let's talk about the price. The MSRP is $180, but I've purchased this from 3 separate retailers, one for $157.49, another for $130.41, and then the cheapest I could find it was for like $128 and some change. It really kind of depends who you purchase it from, but $130 is about what I can find this trigger for. I actually think that this trigger is worth every bit of $180, but hey, if I can find it cheaper, more power to me. Now, I have purchased and used a lot of aftermarket triggers. I've used Rise Armament to Blackout Defense to Timney and Trigger Tech. I've used LaRue. The LaRue MBT is actually a really good trigger for the price, and the Geisley SSAE, that is a top tier trigger. It feels really good, but you will be paying for it too. But honestly, out of all the aftermarket AR-15 triggers, this is up there. This isn't my favorite, but this is one of my favorite AR-15 triggers for sure. Especially for the price. $130, I think that's a really good price for this trigger. Now let's talk about the actual break. It's one of the lightest triggers in Hyperfire's catalog. Here's a graph straight from Hyperfire's website, and the PDI and the Genesis have the lightest trigger out of their catalog. The Elite and ECL have a 2.5 to 3.5 pound trigger, and the EDT is pretty basic at 4.5 to 5.5. The Hyperfire Eclipse and the 24C are the only ones I believe are missing from this list. So let's talk about what the applications are for the Hyperfire PDI trigger. I gotta say, most people are probably utilizing this as a competition style trigger, and that's kind of what it's marketed as. However, I do put this in a PDW style weapon of mine, and kind of the main reason is that it does shoot 7.62 by 39. and I do shoot steel cased with it, and I don't like light primer strikes, and this has kind of alleviated my light primer strike problem. I put this in another 7.62 by 39 AR-15 build, and again, I haven't had any light primer strikes, but that weapon is more of a range toy. The initial reason I purchased this trigger was for a pistol caliber carbine build. I had put a mil-spec trigger in there, and I really wanted an upgrade from that spongy, heavy mil-spec trigger that I'm typically used to now, but I'm really not a big fan of. However, the reason why they suggest using a mil-spec trigger in a pistol caliber carbine build is because of the firing pins. I've shattered firing pins, broke them in half, the tips of them have broke off. I've gone through about 10 firing pins for my pistol caliber carbine. They do say some of the cassette style AR-15 triggers don't hit that firing pin square, it's a little off center, causing some shattering or breakage of your 9mm firing pins. But I've found with the Hiperfire PDI that this alleviates that problem as well. So this is definitely a good competition trigger, and while I haven't used this in any competitions myself, I have seen and heard people use this trigger in their competition builds. A range plinking AR-15 this is pretty good for, as this won't break the bank, and this will offer you a really good light crisp trigger. And I've heard this is a really fast trigger, and I haven't really put that to the test, as most of the ranges I go to limit the rate of fire. It sucks, but it is what it is. I kind of wish I could test how fast I could shoot this trigger. And then for a PCC, this is perfect for a PCC. And there aren't a whole lot of PCC type triggers out there, and I really like that option for this trigger, as I'm an avid AR-15 builder, and just having this trigger around just in case is really quite nice. So let's get to the last option, self-defense. Is this a good self-defense trigger? Well, with training, I think any trigger can be a good self-defense trigger, but this is a very, very light trigger. In fact, the triggers for the Hiperfire PDI that I've tested on a trigger pull gauge have consistently broke under 2 pounds. In fact, I get about 1.5 pounds on average for my average trigger pull for the Hiperfire PDI. It is a very light trigger, but I do use a lot of light triggers in my AR-15s. I am very familiar with it, and I've taken my PDW to training courses and classes, and even my instructor said it was a good trigger. He did think it was a little bit light, but he did like the reliability of it, and I also do like the reliability. The reliability of a trigger is probably the most important aspect to me. And technically I haven't had to use a weapon in self-defense in over a decade, but I have. And I gotta say, I mean, things are a lot different when you are under pressure and your adrenaline's pumping, and they say a light trigger isn't really conducive to a self-defense situation. But regardless of what you want to use this trigger for, or if you're looking at an aftermarket trigger for the AR-15, I do highly recommend the Hiperfire PDI. In fact, this is one of my top 3 triggers that I've tried for the AR-15 platform, and that's saying a lot. I haven't seen any other YouTube reviews on the Hiperfire PDI, and I'm not entirely sure why, as this is a really good trigger. It's underrated, as I see a lot of reviews on the Geisleys, a lot of reviews on the LaRue MBTs, a lot of reviews on Timneys, even trigger techs, and this is kind of looked over by most YouTube reviewers. Are there better triggers out there? Absolutely. I'm not saying this is the best aftermarket trigger, but this is definitely a great aftermarket trigger. But triggers are kind of a personal thing. It's highly subjective, and it really depends on what you want and what kind of feel out of a trigger you like. Some people like single stage, some people like 2-stage. This is a single stage trigger, by the way. And some people don't like a super light trigger, but I'm one that kind of likes a lighter trigger feel. As far as triggers go in the Hyperfire catalog, this is definitely above middle of the road, but it's only $130, or at least I can find it for $130. And the installation is just a drop-in trigger, as some of the other Hyperfire triggers have this cam over toggle engine that's a little bit harder to install. But there are a ton, I mean a ton of aftermarket triggers out there for the AR-15, and they can get quite pricey, as I've spent $180 on a Guys Leak, and I've spent up to $300 on a Trigger Tech, which I don't even own anymore. But for the money, this is one of the best triggers that I can recommend. If you have any other questions, please leave them in the comments below, and like always, thank you for watching.